605 BC. The western bank of the Euphrates River near Carchemish. Egyptian pharaoh Necho II watched his army's right flank dissolve into chaos as waves of Babylonian arrows fell like rain from the sky. For 3 days, his forces had held the crossing points against Nebuchadnezzar's army. Now, in less than an hour, everything was collapsing. The sound that preceded the carnage was unlike anything in ancient warfare up to that point. Not the clash of bronze on bronze or the screams of men in close combat, but a deep thrumming hum as thousands of composite bows released simultaneously. Then the whistle of arrows in flight, then silence, then screaming. The Babylonian archers had just demonstrated a tactical innovation that would change warfare for the next 1,000 years. They had learned to destroy enemy formations before those formations could even reach striking distance. This is the story of how Nebuchadnezzar II, Crown Prince of Babylon, used massed archery as a primary strike weapon rather than a supporting element, how Egyptian chariots and infantry learned that courage meant nothing against arrows you couldn't see coming, and how one battle marked the end of Egyptian imperial ambitions and the beginning of Babylonian dominance over the Near East. The road to Carchemish began 2 decades earlier, when the Assyrian Empire, which had dominated Mesopotamia for centuries, finally collapsed under the combined assault of Babylonians and Medes. In 612 BC, Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, fell to siege. The city that had been the centre of the ancient world's most feared military machine was reduced to burning rubble. But the Assyrian collapse created a power vacuum that every major kingdom wanted to fill. Egypt, under Pharaoh Necho II, saw an opportunity. For centuries, Egypt had been either subject to or threatened by Assyrian power. With Assyria gone, Necho envisioned Egyptian control extending north through Syria and into Mesopotamia itself, recreating the empire of Thutmose III from 800 years earlier. Babylon had different plans. Nabopolassar, the aging king who had led the rebellion against Assyria, was determined that Babylon would inherit Assyrian territory, not share it with Egypt. By 605 BC, Nabopolassar was too ill to campaign personally. He entrusted command of the Babylonian army to his son Nebuchadnezzar, a 30-year-old prince who had already proven himself in combat against Assyrian remnants. Nebuchadnezzar was taking command at a critical moment. Egyptian forces under Necho had pushed north from Palestine, occupying Syria and establishing a strong presence at Carchemish, a fortified city on the Euphrates that controlled the main crossing point between Syria and Mesopotamia. If Egypt consolidated control here, Babylon's western frontier would be permanently threatened. The two armies that converged on Carchemish in the spring of 605 BC represented different military traditions and tactical philosophies. The Egyptian army was built around 3 main components. First, the chariot corps, the pride of Egyptian military might since the New Kingdom period. These were light, fast vehicles drawn by 2 horses, carrying a driver and an archer or spearman. Egyptian chariots had dominated battlefields for centuries, providing mobility and shock power. Second, the infantry, organised in companies of spearmen and axemen who fought in relatively loose formations. These troops were equipped with bronze weapons, shields, and linen armour. They were expected to close with the enemy and fight hand-to-hand, where Egyptian weapons training and physical conditioning would prove decisive. Third, supporting archers, typically Nubian mercenaries or Egyptian light troops who would harass the enemy with arrows before the main infantry and chariot assault. In Egyptian tactical doctrine, archers were useful but secondary. Real fighting meant getting close enough to see your enemy's face. The Babylonian army that Nebuchadnezzar brought to Carchemish was organised differently. It built upon Assyrian military innovations but took them further, especially in the use of missile troops. At the core of Nebuchadnezzar's army were the archers, thousands of them, equipped with composite bows that represented the cutting edge of military technology. The composite bow, perfected over centuries in Mesopotamia, was a weapon that married material science with engineering. Its construction started with a core of wood, usually maple, chosen for flexibility and strength. This was backed with layers of sinew from cattle or horses, material that could stretch under tension without breaking. The belly of the bow, the side facing the archer, was reinforced with plates of horn from water buffalo or ibex, material that compressed without splintering. These layers were glued together with adhesives made from fish bladders and animal hides, then wrapped tightly and left to cure for a year or more. The resulting weapon was only about 3 to 4 feet long, making it manageable for use on horseback or in close formation, but it could generate draw weights of 80 to 100 pounds, sending arrows over 300 yards with enough force to penetrate bronze armour at 100 yards. Babylonian military doctrine had evolved to build tactics around this weapon. Where Assyrians had used archers as one component of combined arms attacks, Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar elevated archery to the primary killing method. His army included formations of archers organised in units of 100, deployed in ranks 6 to 8 men deep. Each archer carried approximately 40 to 60 arrows in 2 quivers, one at the hip and one worn across the back. The arrows themselves were works of precision manufacturing. Each shaft was made from reed or light wood, carefully straightened and weighted to fly true. The flights were made from feathers, usually goose or eagle, split and glued to the shaft in a slight spiral to give the arrow spin in flight. The arrowheads were bronze, usually tanged types that fitted into the hollow reed shaft and were secured with sinew wrapping and glue. Different arrowheads served different purposes. Bodkin points, narrow and piercing, were designed to penetrate armour. Broadleaf shapes created larger wounds against unarmoured targets. Barbed designs made removal difficult and increased bleeding. Nebuchadnezzar's army also included heavy infantry, spearmen equipped with large shields and long spears, who could hold defensive positions or exploit gaps created by archery. There were cavalry units, relatively new to Near Eastern warfare, providing mobility for scouting and pursuit. There were siege engineers who understood how to reduce fortifications. But the tactical foundation was archery, and everything else was designed to support or exploit what the archers could achieve. The Babylonian command structure reflected this priority. The Rab Kisir, the archery commander, held a position of authority second only to the army commander himself. Archery units trained constantly in volley shooting, learning to release simultaneously on command so that arrows would arrive at the target as a concentrated mass rather than a scattered stream. This required discipline and practice. Archers had to judge range collectively, adjust their aim for wind and slope, and maintain their rate of shot over extended periods. The physical demands on an archer were enormous. Drawing an 80-pound bow repeatedly required upper body strength that took years to develop. Assyrian and Babylonian records indicate that archers began training in childhood, building the muscle memory and physical development needed for sustained shooting. Skeletal remains of archers from this period show distinctive bone development in the shoulders and arms, proof of the physical specialization required. By 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar commanded an army that had institutionalized this training. His archers weren't farmers given bows when war came. They were professionals who drilled regularly, maintained their equipment to exacting standards, and understood their role in Babylonian tactical doctrine. When Egyptian scouts reported that a Babylonian army was approaching Carchemish in late spring 605 BC, Pharaoh Necho II had been occupying the city and surrounding territory for several months. He had used this time to fortify his position, establishing a defensive line along the western bank of the Euphrates. The river itself was a significant obstacle. The Euphrates at Carchemish was several hundred yards wide, too deep to ford with a strong current. Any Babylonian attack would have to cross at one of the few suitable points, either at the city itself where bridges existed, or at fording sites several miles upstream or downstream where the river widened and shallowed. Necho positioned his army to cover these approaches. He placed strong forces at the city, where the fortifications gave advantage to the defenders. He stationed chariot units at the Yub, likely fording points, ready to hit any Babylonian force trying to cross while half their men were still in the water. His infantry held the high ground overlooking the river valley, positioned to move quickly to any threatened sector. The Egyptian plan was based on sound tactical principles. Force the enemy to attack across a natural obstacle. Use mobility, the chariot corps, to concentrate force at the decisive point. Let the Babylonians exhaust themselves trying to establish a bridgehead, then counterattack with fresh troops while the enemy was disorganized from the crossing. It was a defensive strategy designed to maximize Egyptian advantages in shock combat while minimizing exposure to missile fire. If the Babylonians wanted Syria, they would have to pay for it in blood at the river's edge. Nebuchadnezzar arrived at Carchemish with a different approach entirely. He had no intention of forcing a river crossing against a prepared defense. Instead, he deployed his army along the eastern bank, establishing camps but making no immediate move to cross. For 3 days, the two armies watched each other across the water. Egyptian scouts reported that the Babylonians appeared to be waiting for something. perhaps reinforcements or supplies. What they were actually doing was reconnaissance. Babylonian cavalry ranged up and down the eastern bank, mapping every detail of the Egyptian positions. Where were the main infantry concentrations? Where were the chariots held in reserve? What were the sight lines and ranges from various positions? Babylonian officers studied the western bank through the clear spring air, noting the layout of the Egyptian camp, the positions of command tents, the locations of horse lines and supply areas. Nebuchadnezzar was gathering information for what would happen next. On the fourth day, Egyptian scouts reported increased activity in the Babylonian camp. Large numbers of troops were moving downstream, away from Carchemish itself. Necho interpreted this as an attempt to find a crossing point, away from the main Egyptian defences. He ordered his chariot corps to move downstream as well, ready to intercept any crossing attempt. This was exactly what Nebuchadnezzar wanted. With significant Egyptian forces pulled away from Carchemish toward the south, Nebuchadnezzar launched his actual attack at an upstream ford several miles north of the city. A picked force of infantry and archers crossed before dawn, moving quietly to establish a bridgehead on the western bank. By the time Egyptian sentries spotted them and raised the alarm, several hundred Babylonian troops were already across and digging in. Necho responded immediately, pulling troops from the Carchemish garrison and sending them north to contain the bridgehead. He also ordered his chariot units, which had been sent downstream, to reverse course and move north. This would take time, as the chariots had to navigate rough terrain along the riverbank. The Egyptian infantry reached the bridgehead first, arriving in the late morning to find Babylonian troops holding a defensive position on a low rise overlooking the ford. The Egyptian commander, following standard tactical doctrine, ordered his men to assault the position. Egyptian spearmen advanced in formation, shields locked, moving uphill toward the Babylonian line. They never reached it. As the Egyptian infantry came within 150 yards of the Babylonian position, the archers who had been concealed behind the rise stood and began shooting. Not scattered individual shots, but organised volleys. The first rank of archers would draw, aim at maximum elevation, and release on command. As their arrows arced into the sky, the second rank would step forward and repeat the process, then the third rank, then the fourth. By the time the first rank's arrows landed, they had already knocked their next arrow and were ready to shoot again. The result was a continuous rain of arrows falling into the Egyptian formation. The initial effect was psychological as much as physical. Egyptian soldiers had experienced arrow fire before, usually scattered shots from Nubian archers that you could see coming and try to block with your shield. This was different. The arrows came from overhead, falling from the sky in waves. You couldn't see them until they were already dropping into your formation. Shields that protected against frontal shots offered little defence against plunging fire. The physical effect was devastating. Bronze arrowheads falling from height had enough force to penetrate the linen armour worn by most Egyptian infantry. Men fell screaming, arrows buried in their shoulders, necks, and heads. Those who survived the first volley found themselves stepping over wounded comrades, even as the next volley arrived. Officers shouted for the formation to press forward, to close the distance where arrows would be less effective. But closing the distance meant climbing uphill under continuous fire. For every yard the Egyptians advanced, more men fell. The mathematics of attrition were brutally simple. Each Babylonian archer could shoot approximately 10 to 12 aimed arrows per minute. With several hundred archers in position, that meant thousands of arrows falling into the Egyptian formation every minute. Even with a hit rate of only 20%, which was conservative given the density of the target formation, the Babylonians were inflicting dozens of casualties every minute while suffering none themselves. The Egyptian assault stalled halfway up the slope. Officers tried to rally their men, but soldiers facing sustained arrow fire without ability to strike back simply couldn't maintain formation. Some men tried to retreat. Others dropped to the ground, seeking any cover. A few brave or foolish individuals tried to rush forward, only to be cut down by concentrated shooting. Within 20 minutes, the Egyptian assault force had suffered perhaps 30% casualties and was streaming back down the slope in disorder. The Babylonian archers continued shooting at the retreating Egyptians, now targeting individuals rather than formations, maximizing casualties, and ensuring the demoralized survivors would spread panic when they reached the main Egyptian line. Nebuchadnezzar, watching from the eastern bank, now committed his main force. thousands of Babylonian infantry and archers began crossing the ford, moving quickly to reinforce the bridgehead while the Egyptians were still disorganized. By early afternoon, the Babylonian force on the western bank had grown to several thousand men, and they began advancing south toward Carchemish itself. Pharaoh Necho, realizing the situation was becoming critical, made the decision that would determine the battle's outcome. He ordered his chariot corps, the mobile reserve and most powerful striking force in his army, to attack the advancing Babylonians. The Egyptian chariots numbered perhaps 600 to 800 vehicles, each carrying a driver and an archer or spearman. They moved north from their positions around Carchemish, forming up on the plain between the river and the city. The sight of the massed chariot corps was impressive, a demonstration of Egyptian military power that had dominated Near Eastern battlefields for centuries. The plan was straightforward. The chariots would charge the Babylonian formation at speed, disrupting their cohesion with the shock of impact. The chariot archers would shoot into the Babylonian ranks at close range, while the spearmen struck at any organized resistance. Once the Babylonian formation was broken, the Egyptian infantry following behind the chariots would move in to finish the destruction. It was a tactic that had worked countless times before against enemies who couldn't stand against the speed and shock of a chariot assault. Nebuchadnezzar and his commanders watched the Egyptian chariots forming up approximately a mile away. This was the moment that Babylonian tactical doctrine had been developed to exploit. Instead of forming a defensive square or seeking cover, the Babylonian infantry and archers formed into a broad, shallow line, 6 to 8 ranks deep, stretching across the likely approach path of the Egyptian charge. The archers moved to the front ranks. The heavy infantry, men with long spears and large shields, formed behind them. Additional archer units formed on the flanks, angled slightly forward to create converging fields of fire. As the Egyptian chariots began their charge, Babylonian officers were shouting range estimates and adjusting their units' positions. The Egyptian chariot corps accelerated into a gallop, horses pulling the light vehicles to speeds approaching 20 miles per hour across the open ground. The sound was tremendous. Thousands of hooves, hundreds of wooden wheels, the shouting of drivers and warriors. At 400 yards distance, still too far for the Egyptian chariot archers to shoot effectively while moving at speed, the Babylonian archers began shooting. The front rank drew, elevated their bows to maximum angle, and released simultaneously. The second rank stepped forward and repeated, then the third. In 10 seconds, nearly 1,000 arrows were in flight, arcing high into the clear air before beginning their descent toward the onrushing chariots. The first volley struck just as the Egyptian charge reached maximum speed. Arrows falling from above hit horses, drivers, and warriors. Horses struck in the neck or haunches stumbled and fell, sending their chariots tumbling, or causing them to crash into vehicles behind them. Drivers fell from their positions and chariots careered out of control. Warriors clutched at arrows buried in their shoulders or heads. But the charge had momentum. The bulk of the chariot force thundered on, now at 300 yards and closing. The Babylonian archers continued shooting, volley after volley falling into the Egyptian formation. More horses fell, more chariots crashed. The neat lines of the Egyptian charge began to dissolve into a chaotic mass of moving vehicles trying to avoid fallen comrades while maintaining forward momentum. At 200 yards, the Egyptian chariot archers began shooting back, but from a moving platform at maximum range, their accuracy was poor. Some arrows fell among the Babylonian ranks, but most missed or lacked the force to penetrate armor and shields. The Babylonian archers, shooting from stationary positions at a large advancing target, continued to achieve devastating effect with nearly every volley. At 100 yards, perhaps 60% of the original Egyptian chariot force was still charging. The survivors, the most skilled drivers and the luckiest, were now close enough for their archery to be effective and were seconds away from crashing into the Babylonian line. This was the critical moment. If the chariots broke the Babylonian formation, if they could disrupt the archers and scatter the infantry, the day might still be saved. Nebuchadnezzar's heavy infantry moved forward, spearmen with large shields forming a hedge of bronze points at chest height for the horses. Behind them, the archers switched to direct fire, shooting at nearly horizontal trajectories into the front ranks of the charging chariots, at distances of 50 yards, then 30, then 20. At these ranges, the composite bows were firing with their full kinetic energy. Arrows struck with enough force to go completely through men's bodies, or bury themselves shaft deep into the chests of horses. The Egyptian charge hit the Babylonian line like a wave hitting a seawall. The front ranks of chariots, those that hadn't been shot down in the final approach, crashed into the hedge of spears. Horses impaled themselves on the bronze points or shied away at the last second, causing their chariots to tip and crash. A few vehicles broke through, but found themselves isolated in the midst of Babylonian heavy infantry, who pulled drivers and warriors from their chariots and killed them with spears and axes. Behind the shattered front ranks, the rest of the Egyptian chariot corps found its charge completely disrupted. Chariots milled in confusion, unable to advance through the wreckage of their own front ranks, taking continuous arrow fire from the flanks where Babylonian archer units were shooting into the packed mass of vehicles and horses at optimal range. What had been an organised charge became a slaughter. Horses, maddened by wounds, tried to bolt. Chariots collided with each other. Warriors abandoned their vehicles and tried to escape on foot. Egyptian officers shouted orders that couldn't be heard over the screaming of horses and men. Through it all, the Babylonian archers continued shooting, maintaining their disciplined volleys, each wave of arrows finding targets in the densely packed Egyptian formation. The Egyptian chariot corps, the pride of Pharaoh Necho's army, disintegrated in less than 30 minutes. Those chariots that could still move fled back toward Carchemish, pursued by Babylonian cavalry who cut down stragglers. The field in front of the Babylonian position was carpeted with dead and dying horses, shattered chariots, and the bodies of Egyptian warriors and drivers, most of them killed by arrows before they ever came to close combat. Pharaoh Necho, watching his elite force destroyed, now faced an impossible situation. His chariot corps was gone. His infantry, which had advanced behind the chariots, was now exposed to the same archery that had just annihilated his mobile forces. His position at Carchemish was becoming untenable, with Babylonian forces established upstream threatening to cut his line of retreat. Necho made the agonizing decision to abandon Carchemish and withdraw toward Egypt. The retreat turned into a rout as Babylonian forces pressed the pursuit. Egyptian infantry, trying to fall back in order, found themselves under constant harassment from Babylonian cavalry and light troops. When they tried to form defensive positions, Babylonian archers would deploy at range and shoot them out of position. When they tried to retreat, cavalry would attack their flanks and rear. The discipline that had held the Egyptian army together as a fighting force dissolved over the course of several days of running battles and continuous retreat. By the time the survivors reached Egyptian territory, Pharaoh Necho's army had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent military force. The Battle of Carchemish was over. Nebuchadnezzar had achieved a victory so complete that it would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the Near East for the next 70 years. But beyond the immediate strategic consequences, the battle had demonstrated a new tactical paradigm. Massed archery, properly employed, could destroy traditional forces before they could close to effective combat range. The Egyptian chariot corps, which had seemed unstoppable for centuries, had been annihilated by men standing still and shooting arrows. This wasn't simply about technology. The composite bow had existed for centuries before Carchemish. Egyptian armies had faced archers before. What made Carchemish different was how Nebuchadnezzar employed his archers. He used them as the primary killing arm, not as a supporting element. He deployed them in mass, creating such density of fire that individual accuracy mattered less than collective volume. He organized them to shoot in disciplined volleys that maximized the number of arrows in flight at any given moment. Most importantly, he built his entire tactical system around archery. The heavy infantry didn't attack. They defended the archers and held the position from which the archers could dominate the battlefield. The cavalry didn't charge into combat. They pursued broken enemies and prevented Egyptian forces from maneuvering to avoid the killing zones. Every element of the Babylonian army was designed to create conditions where archers could shoot and keep shooting without interruption. This represented a fundamental shift in how ancient armies thought about warfare. For millennia, missile weapons had been seen as preliminary to the real fighting that happened at close range with spear, sword, and axe. Archers were useful for harassing the enemy and inflicting some casualties before the main combat, but decisive results came from close combat. Carchemish proved this assumption wrong. Nebuchadnezzar had shown that properly organized missile troops could achieve decisive results on their own. that battles could be won by killing the enemy at range before close combat ever occurred. The implications rippled through Near Eastern military thinking. Within decades, every major power was reorganizing their armies to emphasize archery. The percentage of archers in armies increased dramatically. Training regimens became more rigorous and standardized. Tactical doctrines evolved to prioritize the creation of killing zones where massed archery could be employed. Technology evolved as well. Composite bows became more powerful and more efficient. Arrow production became standardized, with quality control ensuring consistent performance. Armor evolved in response, becoming heavier and more extensive to protect against the increased arrow threat. The social organization of armies changed. Archery required years of training to achieve the strength and skill needed for sustained combat shooting. This meant that archers couldn't be militia or short-term levies. They had to be professionals, men who trained continuously and made warfare their life's work. This professionalization of ancient armies, which had begun with Assyria and accelerated under Babylon, became the standard throughout the Near East. The economic implications were enormous. Professional archers had to be paid, equipped, and maintained year-round, not just during campaign seasons. Arrows had to be manufactured in vast quantities. A single battle might consume tens of thousands of arrows, all of which had to be produced by skilled craftsmen working with specialized materials. The composite bow itself required such skilled labor and time to produce that they became valuable items, carefully maintained and passed down. Maintaining an army capable of the kind of firepower Nebuchadnezzar had demonstrated at Carchemish required resources that only wealthy, organized states could afford. This contributed to the consolidation of power into larger empires. Small kingdoms simply couldn't compete militarily with states that could field thousands of professional archers backed by the industrial base to keep them equipped. For Egypt, Carchemish marked the end of its imperial ambitions. Pharaoh Necho II never again attempted to project power into Syria or Mesopotamia. The loss of the army, particularly the elite chariot corps, left Egypt unable to compete with Babylon. Egyptian military thinking, which had been largely unchanged for centuries, had proven inadequate against the new tactical realities. Subsequent pharaohs would focus on defending Egypt itself rather than attempting to dominate the Near East. For Babylon, Carchemish was the beginning of 70 years of dominance. Nebuchadnezzar, who became king shortly after the battle when his father died, would rule for 43 years and build Babylon into the greatest city of the ancient world. His empire would stretch from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf, secured by an army whose tactical superiority was unquestioned. The famous Hanging Gardens, the Ishtar Gate, the walls of Babylon, all these wonders were built on the foundation of military supremacy established at Carchemish. The tactical lessons of Carchemish would echo through military history. The concept that missile weapons could be decisive rather than supplementary would be proven again by English longbowmen at Crecy and Agincourt, by Ottoman archers and gunpowder weapons, by riflemen in the Napoleonic Wars, by machine gunners in World War I. Each age had to relearn that disciplined soldiers with effective ranged weapons, properly employed, could destroy traditional forces before those forces could close to effective range. The specific story of Carchemish was largely forgotten outside specialist scholarship. The battle doesn't have the name recognition of Thermopylae or Marathon. Most people couldn't place it on a map or tell you who fought there. But its importance to military history is fundamental. It demonstrated for the first time that ranged combat could be the primary killing method in warfare, not just a preliminary to close combat. It showed that technology, tactics, and training could overcome traditional martial virtues like courage and physical prowess. The archaeological evidence from Carchemish itself, what remains of it, tells part of the story. Excavations in the early 20th century revealed a destruction layer dated to approximately 605 BC. Bronze arrowheads, hundreds of them, were found scattered across the ancient battlefield. Analysis of skeletal remains from mass graves showed patterns of injury consistent with arrow wounds, many striking from above, the characteristic pattern of plunging fire from massed archery. The city itself showed signs of hasty abandonment, followed by systematic looting, consistent with Egyptian forces retreating and Babylonian forces occupying the site. Contemporary records provide more detail. The Babylonian Chronicles, a series of cuneiform tablets recording major events year by year, describe the battle. The entry for the 21st year of Nabopolassar's reign, which corresponds to 605 BC, states that the crown prince Nebuchadnezzar crossed the river and did battle with the Egyptian army which lay in Carchemish. He accomplished their defeat and beat them to non-existence. Egyptian records are notably silent about Carchemish. This silence itself is telling. Egyptian royal inscriptions typically described pharaonic military campaigns in glowing terms, even when those campaigns were failures. The complete absence of any contemporary Egyptian account of Carchemish suggests a disaster so complete that even the usual propaganda couldn't spin it positively. Later Egyptian texts occasionally refer to the withdrawal from Syria, but without giving details of how or why the withdrawal occurred. Biblical sources provide another perspective. The book of Jeremiah, chapter 46, describes Carchemish, referring to Egypt going up like the Nile, like rivers of surging waters, but being defeated. The passage describes Egyptian warriors fleeing and not looking back, terror on every side. While religious texts must be read carefully as historical sources, the account in Jeremiah is consistent with what we know from other sources about the scale of the Egyptian defeat. For the soldiers who fought at Carchemish, those who survived, the experience must have been transformative. Egyptian warriors who had believed their chariot corps was invincible watched it destroyed by men standing still with bows. Babylonian archers who had trained for years to shoot accurately and quickly discovered that their skills, applied en masse, could determine the outcome of battles. Officers on both sides learned that traditional tactical assumptions no longer held, that new methods required new responses. The wounded, those who survived arrow strikes, faced particular challenges. Ancient medicine could do little for deep arrow wounds. Many of those injured at Carchemish would have died slowly from infection in the days and weeks following the battle. The lucky ones, those with superficial wounds or arrows that could be removed cleanly, would carry scars for life. Physical reminders of the day, archery became a decisive weapon. The psychological impact extended beyond those who were present. Stories of Carchemish spread throughout the ancient Near East. Soldiers in other armies heard about the Egyptian chariot corps being destroyed by archery. Kings and generals studied what had happened and adjusted their own tactics and organizations accordingly. The Persians, who would conquer Babylon within 70 years, built their own military system around massed archery, learning from Babylonian methods. The Greeks, who would face Persian archery at Marathon and Thermopylae, developed the hoplite phalanx partly as a response to the archery threat, creating formations with such density that arrows struggled to penetrate. In this way, Carchemish influenced military development for centuries. The battle also marked a transition in how wars were decided. In earlier periods, battles were often extended melees where physical stamina, individual courage, and close combat skills determined outcomes. Casualties, while significant, were often concentrated in defeated armies that broke and ran, not in the fighting itself. Carchemish demonstrated that battles could be decided by inflicting mass casualties at range, before close combat ever occurred. This made warfare more lethal and more decisive. Armies could be destroyed in hours rather than ground down over days of fighting. The human cost of this transition was enormous. The casualty rates at Carchemish, particularly among the Egyptian forces, were likely much higher than in earlier battles. Where ancient battles might have seen 10 to 20% casualties for the losing side, Carchemish probably saw Egyptian losses exceeding 50% of their deployed force, with most casualties occurring in a single afternoon. For Nebuchadnezzar personally, Carchemish was a defining moment. He had taken command of the Babylonian army at a critical juncture and achieved a victory so complete that it secured his reputation and his throne. When he became king shortly after the battle, there was no question of his legitimacy or capability. He had proven himself the equal of the greatest Assyrian kings in military skill. His subsequent reign, which included the famous conquest of Jerusalem and the Babylonian captivity of the Jewish people, was built on the military foundation established at Carchemish. He ruled an empire that was essentially unchallenged for decades because no neighbouring power wanted to face the army that had destroyed Egypt so completely. The weapons that made Carchemish possible, the composite bows and bronze-tipped arrows, were products of centuries of technological refinement. The composite bow had evolved from simple wooden bows over millennia, with craftsmen gradually discovering how different materials could be combined to create greater power and efficiency. By 605 BC, bowmaking had become a sophisticated craft requiring specialized knowledge and materials. A master bowyer had to understand wood properties, knowing which species provided flexibility without brittleness. He had to source sinew, typically from cattle or horses, and know how to process it into usable backing material. Horn had to be obtained from specific animals and worked into thin plates that could be glued to the bow's belly. The adhesives had to be formulated to remain flexible in hot conditions, but strong enough to hold the composite layers together under the enormous stresses of repeated shooting. Building a high-quality composite bow took months of skilled labour. The materials had to be layered and glued precisely, then wrapped tightly and left to cure. This curing process couldn't be rushed. Moisture had to evaporate slowly from the glue while the layers bonded together. If done too quickly, the bow would be weak or would delaminate under use. If done too slowly, the materials might deteriorate. The finished bow had to be tillered, carefully bent and adjusted so that it drew smoothly and shot accurately. Poor tillering could cause the bow to break or to shoot inconsistently. The entire process required such specialized knowledge that bowyers became valued craftsmen. Babylonian records indicate that skilled bowyers were exempt from certain taxes and labor obligations, recognition of their strategic importance. A good bow was an expensive item, worth perhaps several months of a skilled worker's wages. This made them valuable property that was carefully maintained and occasionally passed down through families. Arrows were equally sophisticated. Each arrow had to be perfectly straight or it would fly erratically. The shaft had to be weighted correctly for the bow's power. Too light, and the arrow would lack force. Too heavy, and it wouldn't fly far. The fletching had to be carefully attached at just the right angle to stabilize flight. The arrowhead had to be securely attached and properly aligned with the shaft. Making arrows required different skills than making bows. Shaft makers selected straight-grained reed or wood, shaped it to precise dimensions, and straightened it over heat. Fletchers split feathers and attached them with precise angles and spacing. Smiths forged bronze arrowheads to specific patterns, creating tangs that would fit securely into the hollow shaft. Assemblers brought these components together, using sinew wrapping and glue to create a finished arrow that would fly true and strike with force. The industrial organization required to supply an army with arrows was substantial. A single battle could consume tens of thousands of arrows. A campaign season might require hundreds of thousands. This meant that Babylon needed workshops producing arrows continuously, with supply chains bringing in raw materials and distributing finished products to military units. The logistics of arrow supply became a strategic consideration. Armies had to carry sufficient arrows for anticipated combat while not being overburdened by excessive weight. Supply trains had to bring forward additional ammunition as campaigns progressed. After battles, efforts were made to recover arrows that could be reused, with soldiers searching battlefields to collect arrows that were still serviceable. Even broken arrows were valuable, as the arrowheads could be remounted on new shafts. The training required to use these weapons effectively was extensive. Modern experiments with replica composite bows have shown that repeatedly drawing an 80 to 100-pound bow requires specific muscle development. The drawing motion uses muscles in the shoulders, back, and arms in a way that normal daily activities don't develop. Beginning archers simply lack the strength to draw such powerful bows more than a few times. Building the necessary strength takes months or years of progressive training. Historical sources and skeletal evidence suggest that Babylonian archers began training in childhood or adolescence, building strength gradually as they matured. By adulthood, they had the physical capability to shoot powerful bows repeatedly for extended periods. But physical strength was only part of the training. Accuracy required practice. Judging distance, compensating for wind and slope, aiming at moving targets, all these skills had to be learned through repetition. Historical sources indicate that archers practiced constantly, shooting at targets at various ranges, learning to adjust their aim for different conditions. The most difficult skill was volley shooting in formation. This required archers to judge range collectively, adjust their elevation uniformly, and release simultaneously on command. The goal was to have arrows arrive at the target area as a concentrated mass, maximizing the shock effect and density of fire. This couldn't be accomplished if archers were shooting individually at their own pace. It required discipline, practice, and responsive command and control. Babylonian archers trained in this formation shooting extensively. drilling in their units under officer supervision. The payoff came in battles like Carchemish, where disciplined volley shooting created the wall of arrows that destroyed Egyptian formations. This level of training and specialization meant that Babylonian archers weren't expendable troops. Each archer represented years of training and development. Losing archers in battle meant losing military capability that couldn't be quickly replaced. This encouraged tactical approaches that preserved archer strength while maximizing their killing power, exactly what Nebuchadnezzar achieved at Carchemish by using his archers from relatively protected positions, while Egyptian forces advanced into their killing zone. The legacy of Carchemish extended far beyond 605 BC. The tactical innovations demonstrated their influenced warfare throughout the ancient period. Subsequent empires, Persian, Macedonian, Roman, all had to develop responses to massed archery. The Persians embraced it, building their own army around large numbers of archers backed by cavalry. The Greeks developed heavy infantry tactics designed to close with archers quickly and engage them in close combat where archery was less effective. The Macedonians combined both approaches, using pike phalanxes supported by archer and cavalry forces. The Romans initially struggled against Eastern archers, but eventually developed combined arms tactics that neutralized the archery threat through flexible formations and supporting missile troops of their own. Throughout these developments, the fundamental lesson of Carchemish remained relevant. Disciplined soldiers with effective ranged weapons could dominate battlefields if employed properly. This made ranged weapons a strategic priority and forced armies to develop tactics, training, and equipment that could deal with the archery threat. In 539 BC, 36 years after Carchemish, the Babylonian Empire fell to Cyrus the Great of Persia. Ironically, the Persians defeated Babylon partly by employing the same massed archery tactics that Nebuchadnezzar had used to establish Babylonian dominance. The cycle continued. Methods developed at Carchemish had spread, been refined, and eventually were turned against their originators. But the tactical paradigm shift had occurred. Missile weapons were now understood as potentially decisive, not just supplementary. This understanding, born in the killing fields along the Euphrates in 605 BC, would shape warfare for millennia to come. The specific details of Carchemish, the names of most participants, the exact tactics employed, much of this was lost or obscured over time. But the essential lesson remained part of military thinking. That lesson, demonstrated when Babylonian archers destroyed an Egyptian army, was simple but profound. The side that can kill from distance while avoiding close combat has a fundamental advantage. Exploiting that advantage requires technology, training, and tactical skill. But when executed properly, ranged combat can achieve decisive results that traditional methods cannot match. From the composite bows of Babylon to modern firearms and missiles, this principle has driven military development for 2,600 years. It all began at Carchemish, where for the first time in recorded history, arrows proved more decisive than courage, and tactical innovation defeated traditional military power. The Egyptian chariots that charged across that field expecting victory found instead a new kind of warfare, one where battles could be won without ever drawing a sword. The thunder of hooves was drowned out by the whistle of arrows, and warfare was never the same again. The transformation of Near Eastern warfare after Carchemish manifested in ways both immediate and gradual. Within months of the battle, military officials from kingdoms throughout the region were demanding reports on what exactly had happened along the Euphrates. How had the Egyptian army, one of the most formidable forces in the ancient world, been so completely destroyed? The answers that filtered back through merchant reports, diplomatic correspondence, and accounts from survivors painted a picture that challenged every assumption about how wars were won. The traditional narrative of ancient warfare had emphasized heroic individual, combat, the clash of champions, the decisive chariot charge that broke enemy formations. Egyptian military art from the New Kingdom period depicted pharaohs in their chariots, trampling enemies underfoot, shooting arrows at fleeing foes. Assyrian palace reliefs showed kings hunting lions and leading armies into battle, emphasizing personal martial prowess. The entire cultural framework of warfare in the Near East celebrated close combat and individual heroism. Carchemish suggested that this framework was obsolete. The most heroic Egyptian warriors, those who had charged most bravely toward the Babylonian line, had simply been killed at distance by men they never reached. Courage, which had always been considered the paramount military virtue, had proven insufficient against properly organised firepower. This was a deeply unsettling realisation for military aristocracies, whose entire social position was based on their role as warriors. The immediate military responses varied by kingdom and circumstance. The Medes, who had been Babylon's allies against Assyria, began reorganising their own forces to emphasise archery. Median cavalry, which had traditionally focused on shock charges with spears and swords, began training extensively with composite bows, creating the mounted archer tradition that would later become famous under Persian rule. The Lydians in Anatolia, watching events in Mesopotamia with concern, increased their own production of armour and shields, reasoning that if arrows were now the primary threat, better protection was essential. Lydian bronze workers developed techniques for creating laminated armour with multiple layers that could better resist arrow penetration than single plates. The city-states of Phoenicia, always pragmatic about military matters, hired Babylonian military advisors to train their own archer corps. Phoenician merchants, with their extensive trade networks, had access to the materials needed for composite bow production, and their wealthy cities could afford to maintain professional archer forces. Within a decade of Carchemish, Phoenician contingents were fielding archers trained in Babylonian methods. The Israelite kingdoms of Judah and Israel, caught between Egyptian and Babylonian spheres of influence, drew their own lessons. Biblical accounts from the period following Carchemish show increased emphasis on fortifications and defensive warfare. If battles in open field now favoured whoever could deploy more archers, smaller kingdoms with limited manpower had to rely on fortified positions where walls and towers could offset the enemy's numerical and tactical advantages. This defensive orientation would characterise Judean military strategy through the subsequent Babylonian invasions with limited success. The Aramean states in Syria, which had been contested between Egypt and Babylon, quickly accommodated themselves to Babylonian dominance after Carchemish. Having witnessed or heard detailed accounts of what happened to Egyptian forces, Aramean rulers had no desire to test their own armies against Babylonian archery. Most submitted to Babylonian overlordship without significant resistance, providing tribute and auxiliary forces when requested. This pragmatic submission was itself a consequence of Carchemish. Battles that could be decided so quickly and decisively made military resistance seem futile unless you could match the victor's capabilities. The economic ripples from Carchemish were as significant as the military ones. The materials required for composite bow production, particularly high-quality horn and sinew, became strategic resources. Babylon established trade relationships specifically to ensure access to these materials. Water buffalo horn from Mesopotamian marshlands, ibex horn from mountain regions, sinew from cattle herds, all had to be collected, processed and transported to bow-making workshops. The scale of demand was unprecedented. Maintaining an army with thousands of archers meant continuous bow production to replace worn or damaged equipment. A composite bow had a service life of perhaps 10 to 20 years if properly maintained, but battlefield damage and hard use meant that replacements were constantly needed. Babylonian administrative records from Nebuchadnezzar's reign show substantial resources devoted to bow procurement and production. Arrow production created its own economic infrastructure. Bronze working, always important in the ancient Near East, became even more critical. Arrowheads required relatively small amounts of bronze per unit, but the quantities needed were enormous. A single campaign might require hundreds of thousands of arrowheads. This meant mines producing copper and tin, smelters refining the metals, workshops forging the arrowheads, all operating at scales that strained available resources and labour. Reed harvesting for arrow shafts became a specialised industry in Mesopotamia, where the Euphrates and Tigris marshlands provided ideal growing conditions for the straight, hollow reeds preferred for arrows. Harvesting had to be timed correctly to get reeds of the right maturity and straightness. Processing required drying and straightening the shafts, work that employed substantial numbers of workers. Feather collection for fletching created demand for waterfowl and raptors. Geese were raised partly for their feathers, which were carefully sorted to select those suitable for arrow fletching. Eagle and hawk feathers, prized for their stiffness and durability, were gathered from wild birds or from hunting. Each arrow required 3 or 4 matched feathers, precisely split and attached, meaning that feather supplies had to be maintained continuously. The glues and adhesives required for both bow making and arrow production created their own supply chains. Fish bladder glue, considered the best for bow construction, required processing substantial numbers of fish. Animal hide glues used for arrow assembly needed rendering facilities where hides were boiled down to extract collagen. These were unpleasant, smelly operations, but strategically necessary. The result was that Babylonian military power rested on an extensive economic foundation that transformed regional trade patterns and resource allocation. Cities that could supply these materials prospered. Merchants who could organize the logistics became wealthy. Craftsmen with the necessary skills commanded premium wages. The entire economic structure of the Babylonian Empire was shaped partly by the requirements of maintaining the military force that had proven so effective at Carchemish. Nebuchadnezzar's building projects in Babylon, the famous walls and gates and palaces, were financed by tribute and trade that flowed into Babylon precisely because its military dominance was unquestioned. That military dominance, in turn, rested on organizational and tactical innovations that had been demonstrated definitively at Carchemish. The strategic situation in the Near East after 605 BC reflected this new reality. Egypt, having lost its army, and with it any ability to project power northward, withdrew to defend its own borders. Necho spent the remainder of his reign strengthening Egypt's defences and avoiding confrontation with Babylon. His successors maintained this cautious policy. For the next 7 decades, Egypt would be essentially a regional power, not the imperial force it had been during the New Kingdom period. Babylon, by contrast, expanded aggressively. Nebuchadnezzar campaigned repeatedly in Syria and Palestine, bringing the entire Levant under Babylonian control. When Judah attempted to rebel in 597 BC, Nebuchadnezzar besieged Jerusalem and deported much of its population to Babylon. When rebellion erupted again in 587 BC, he returned, destroyed the city and its temple, and carried away most of the remaining population. These campaigns were possible because Babylon faced no serious military opposition. No kingdom in the region could field forces capable of standing against Babylonian armies in open battle. The tactics demonstrated at Carchemish had given Babylon such military superiority that opposition was futile. This created a feedback loop. Military dominance brought tribute and trade revenues. These revenues funded the military establishment. The military establishment maintained dominance. The system was stable as long as Babylon could maintain its technological and organizational advantages. For most of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, it did. His armies were well trained, well equipped, and employed tactics that other kingdoms struggled to counter. The challenges came from within rather than without. Maintaining professional military forces was expensive. As the empire aged and faced fewer external threats, there was pressure to reduce military spending. After Nebuchadnezzar's death in 562 BC, Babylon experienced political instability with several short-lived kings. Military readiness declined as resources were diverted to political struggles. By the time Nabonidus became king in 556 BC, the Babylonian military was no longer the dominant force it had been under Nebuchadnezzar. Training standards had slipped. Equipment maintenance had been deferred. The organizational discipline that made massed archery effective had degraded. When Cyrus the Great of Persia began his expansion in the 540s BC, he faced a Babylon that was still wealthy and impressive but militarily weakened. The Persian army that Cyrus commanded had learned from Babylonian methods. Persian forces included large numbers of archers using composite bows. They employed volley shooting and massed fire tactics. They understood how to use archery to dominate battlefields. In effect, the Persians had absorbed and refined the innovations that Babylon had demonstrated at Carchemish. When Persian and Babylonian forces finally met in 539 BC at the Battle of Opis, the result was almost inevitable. The Babylonian army, no longer the well-trained force of Nebuchadnezzar's time, was defeated by Persians using tactics and weapon systems that Babylon had pioneered. The irony was profound. The methods that had given Babylon dominance for 70 years were now employed by its conqueror. Cyrus entered Babylon without resistance after Opis. The city that Nebuchadnezzar had built, financed by military dominance established at Carchemish, became the capital of the Persian Empire. The Babylonian archer corps, what remained of it, was absorbed into Persian service. Many of the tactical and organizational innovations developed under Nebuchadnezzar continued under Persian administration. The Persians, however, took these methods further. Under Darius the Risen and his successors, the Persian Empire created the largest and most sophisticated archer forces the ancient world had yet seen. Persian tactics emphasized the combination of archers and cavalry, using mobility to position archer forces optimally, while cavalry prevented enemy maneuver. The famous Persian immortals, the elite 10,000-man royal guard, were primarily archers backed by spearmen. Persian armies at their height could field tens of thousands of archers, creating firepower densities that exceeded anything Babylon had achieved. This Persian archery doctrine would shape military affairs in the Near Eastern Mediterranean for the next 2 centuries. When Persian forces invaded Greece in the early 5th century BC, Greek city-states faced the same challenge that Egypt had faced at Carchemish. How do you fight an enemy who can kill you at distance before you can close to effective range? The Greek response was the hoplite phalanx, taken to its ultimate development. Greek heavy infantry wore bronze armour covering most of their bodies. They carried large shields that could overlap with those of neighbouring soldiers. They fought in densely packed formations, 8 to 12 ranks deep, presenting a nearly solid wall of shields and spear points. This formation was designed specifically to survive approach through arrow fire and close with archers before archery could inflict decisive casualties. The tactic worked, but only under specific conditions. At Marathon in 490 BC, Athenian hoplites charged across nearly a mile of open ground to reach Persian positions, taking arrow casualties throughout the approach, but maintaining formation cohesion. When they reached the Persian line, the close combat heavily favoured the armoured, well-drilled Greek infantry. The Persians, whose strength was in archery and mobility, couldn't stand against the Greek charge and were routed. At Thermopylae in 480 BC, Greek hoplites used terrain to neutralise Persian archery advantages. Fighting in a narrow pass where the Persians couldn't deploy their full numbers or manoeuvre around the Greek position, the Greeks held for 3 days until betrayed by a local guide who showed the Persians a mountain path around the position. Even then, the final Greek stand inflicted heavy casualties on Persian forces, trying to overwhelm the position through frontal assault. At Plataea in 479 BC, the climactic Battle of the Persian invasion, Greek forces again used heavy infantry tactics to defeat Persian archery. The Greeks advanced in formation, absorbed arrow casualties during the approach, then shattered Persian infantry in close combat. The Persian cavalry, which might have exploited gaps or attacked flanks, was neutralized by Greek cavalry and light troops. These Greek victories demonstrated that massed archery, powerful as it was, wasn't invincible. Heavy infantry that could survive the approach in close to hand-to-hand combat could still prevail. But the tactics required to achieve this were demanding. Soldiers needed extensive armour, which was expensive. They needed intensive training to maintain formation under fire. They needed courage or discipline sufficient to advance through continuous arrow casualties. Not all armies could meet these requirements. The success of Greek hoplites against Persian archers was exceptional, not typical. For most ancient armies, the combination of archery and mobility that Persians had perfected remained extremely difficult to counter. This would be proven repeatedly in subsequent centuries. Alexander the Great, when he invaded Persia in 334 BC, faced the same archery forces that had threatened Greece. His solution was to combine Greek heavy infantry with improved cavalry and mobile light troops, creating a combined arm system that could neutralize archers through multiple threats simultaneously. While his phalanx advanced to pin Persian forces, his cavalry would sweep around flanks to attack archers from behind or from the side, where they were vulnerable. The Macedonian system worked brilliantly in Alexander's hands, but it required extraordinary coordination and leadership to execute. After Alexander's death, his successors tried to employ similar tactics with mixed results. The Roman legions, which would eventually dominate the Mediterranean world, developed their own response to Eastern archery. Roman infantry fought in more flexible formations than Greek phalanxes, allowing them to maneuver on the battlefield while maintaining cohesion. They combined heavy infantry with substantial numbers of their own missile troops, javelin men, and, later, auxiliary archers. Roman tactics emphasized closing quickly with the enemy, using javelins at short range to disrupt enemy formations, then engaging in close combat where Roman training and equipment gave advantage. Against Parthian and later Sassanid Persian archery, Romans struggled. The disaster at Carrhae in 53 BC, where Parthian horse archers destroyed a Roman army under Crassus, demonstrated that Eastern archery tactics remained lethal centuries after Carchemish. The Parthians used mounted archers to maintain distance from Roman infantry, shooting continuously while the Romans exhausted themselves trying to close. The Romans had no effective counter to this mobile archery and were systematically destroyed. Later Roman responses included more cavalry, more auxiliary archers of their own, and better coordination between infantry and supporting troops. But Eastern archery remained a serious threat throughout Roman history. The broader pattern across these centuries was clear. The tactical innovation demonstrated at Carchemish, using massed archery as the primary killing method in warfare, had become a permanent feature of military affairs. Every major power had to develop either their own archery capabilities or tactics to counter enemy archers. The cultural impact was equally significant. The emphasis on archery and missile combat changed how warfare was perceived and described. Earlier traditions had celebrated close combat and personal heroism. Epic poetry and royal inscriptions emphasized individual champions and heroic deeds. The Iliad, composed around the time of Carchemish, describes warfare as primarily close combat between heroes, with archery playing a supporting role often portrayed as less honourable than spear or sword combat. Post-Carchemish military culture had to accommodate the reality that battles were increasingly decided by mass archery, not individual heroism. This created tension in how warfare was portrayed. Official accounts still emphasized royal leadership and heroic virtues, but practical military handbooks and tactical treatises focused on formation discipline, archery technique, and organizational efficiency. The anonymous archers shooting volleys on command weren't celebrated in the same way as heroic champions, but they were the ones actually determining battle outcomes. This shift affected military recruitment and training throughout the ancient world. Earlier armies had often been built around aristocratic warriors who could afford their own equipment and had the leisure time to train. Archery-based tactics required professional soldiers who trained constantly, not part-time warriors. This professionalization changed the relationship between states and their militaries. Soldiers became more clearly servants of the state, paid and equipped by royal or civic authority, rather than independent warriors fighting for honor and plunder. The social implications rippled through ancient societies. Professional military classes developed with their own cultures and loyalties. The relationship between military and civilian authority became more complex as armies became standing forces rather than militia, called up for specific campaigns. Military expenditure became a major component of state budgets, requiring more sophisticated taxation and economic organization. All of this traced back, at least partly, to the tactical transformation that Carchemish represented. Once archery became decisive, the organizational and economic requirements for military effectiveness increased dramatically. Only states that could meet these requirements could compete militarily. This drove political consolidation into larger, more organized empires. The technological development of archery continued throughout the ancient period and into the medieval era. Composite bows became more refined, with better materials and more sophisticated construction techniques. By the time of the Mongol conquests in the 13th century AD, composite bows had reached their maximum effectiveness for pre-gunpowder technology. Mongol bows could shoot arrows over 300 yards with enough force to penetrate most armor at 100 yards. Their construction involved hundreds of hours of skilled labor and represented the culmination of millennia of bow-making refinement. The Mongols employed mass archery tactics that would have been familiar to Babylonian commanders at Carchemish. Mongol armies consisted primarily of mounted archers who fought in disciplined formations, shooting volleys on command. Their tactics emphasized mobility and firepower, avoiding close combat when possible, while destroying enemies with concentrated archery. The success of Mongol armies across Asia and into Europe demonstrated that even after 800 years, the fundamental tactical paradigm established at Carchemish remained viable. English longbows, used to devastating effect at Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt in the 14th and 15th centuries AD, represented a different technological path to similar tactical ends. The longbow wasn't a composite weapon, but a simple self-bow made from a single piece of yew wood. It was cheaper and easier to produce than composite bows, though it required even more strength to draw and more years of training to use effectively. English kings mandated archery practice for their subjects, creating a pool of trained archers that could be mobilized for military service. English tactics with longbows paralleled Babylonian methods in key ways. Archers fought in massed formations, shooting volleys that created zones of destruction through sheer volume of arrows, At Crécy in 1346, English archers inflicted devastating casualties on French cavalry and infantry, much as Babylonian archers had destroyed Egyptian chariots at Carchemish. The technological details differed, but the tactical principle was the same. Disciplined missile troops properly positioned and supplied could destroy traditional forces before close combat occurred. The introduction of gunpowder weapons in the 14th and 15th centuries eventually made bows obsolete, but the tactical principles established at Carchemish carried over into firearms tactics. Early arquebuses and muskets were slow to load and inaccurate, but they were even more lethal than arrows against armour. As firearms improved, infantry tactics evolved around creating maximum firepower through ranked volleys, exactly the principle that Babylonian archers had employed. By the 18th century, European linear tactics had infantry formed in thin lines, 2 or 3 ranks deep, firing volleys in sequence to maintain continuous fire on the enemy. The specific weapons had changed from bows to muskets to rifles, but the underlying concept remained consistent with what Nebuchadnezzar had demonstrated in 605 BC. The side that could deliver more effective fire at range while maintaining formation and discipline would dominate the battlefield. Modern military theory still reflects these ancient lessons. Fire and maneuver, the fundamental tactical concept of modern warfare, is essentially an elaboration of principles first systematically applied at Carchemish. One element provides suppressive fire, keeping the enemy pinned or disrupted. Another element maneuvers to a position of advantage. The two elements work together, creating conditions where the enemy can be destroyed without the attacker suffering equivalent casualties. This is precisely what Nebuchadnezzar achieved when his archers provided the killing power, while his heavy infantry held position and his cavalry exploited success. The weapons have changed from bows to rifles to machine guns to missiles. The principles remain recognizable to any military historian familiar with ancient Near Eastern warfare. In this sense, Carchemish wasn't just a battle. It was a demonstration of tactical principles that would prove valid across millennia of military history. The specific context was unique to its time. Egyptian chariots facing Babylonian archers along the Euphrates in 605 BC. But the underlying dynamics, the use of ranged weapons to achieve decisive results, the employment of mass and discipline to concentrate firepower, the integration of different arms into a coherent tactical system, these would be rediscovered and reapplied countless times throughout history. For the participants at Carchemish, of course, these long-term implications were unknowable. The Egyptian warriors charging toward the Babylonian line that spring morning in 605 BC weren't thinking about how their deaths would influence military theory for millennia. They were focused on immediate survival, on reaching the enemy before the next volley of arrows arrived, on maintaining formation as comrades fell around them. The Babylonian archers, shooting volley after volley into the Egyptian formations, were concentrating on their immediate tasks: judge the range, check your angle, draw smoothly, release on command, knock the next arrow, repeat. The battle wasn't an abstract tactical problem to them. It was noise and confusion, and the physical strain of drawing heavy bows repeatedly. It was watching your arrows arc into the sky and fall into enemy formations. It was seeing men fall and formations dissolve, and knowing that your shooting was causing that destruction. For the commanders, Pharaoh Necho watching his army disintegrate, Nebuchadnezzar observing his tactical plan succeed beyond expectation, the battle was intensely personal. Their reputations, their political positions, potentially their lives depended on the outcome. The decisions they made, where to commit reserves, when to order retreat or pursuit, were made under enormous pressure with incomplete information. That they made those decisions in ways that reflected sound tactical principles speaks to their professional competence. That Nebuchadnezzar's decisions proved superior speaks to his better understanding of how the tools available to him could be most effectively employed. The aftermath of Carchemish was grim for those on the losing side. Egyptian survivors of the battle faced a desperate retreat through territory that was turning hostile as local populations sensed Egyptian weakness. Many who survived the battle itself died during the retreat from exhaustion, wounds that became infected, or attacks by local forces. Those who eventually reached Egypt carried with them the trauma of catastrophic defeat. The psychological scars of watching your army destroyed, of surviving when so many comrades died, of fleeing in disorder from an enemy you couldn't reach or hurt, these affected survivors for the rest of their lives, For Babylonian forces, victory brought its own costs. Even on the winning side, men had died. Babylonian formations that held against Egyptian charges, that fought to maintain the bridgehead upstream from Carchemish, had taken casualties. The pursuit of the defeated Egyptians, while one-sided, still involved combat where some Babylonians were killed or wounded. The wounded, even on the victorious side, faced grim prospects. Ancient medicine could treat some wounds but was helpless against many others. Infections were common and often fatal. Men with shattered bones or deep cuts might survive if lucky, but many would die slowly in the days and weeks after the battle. Even the unwounded carried burdens. The physical exhaustion of combat, the mental strain of killing and watching death, the disruption to normal life that military service represented, all took their toll. Professional soldiers were better prepared for these stresses than conscripts, but they still felt them. The ancient world didn't have concepts like post-traumatic stress disorder, but the symptoms certainly existed. Veterans of intense combat like Carchemish would carry memories of the experience for life, memories that could intrude on daily living and disturb sleep. The broader human cost extended to the families of those who fought. Women who lost husbands or sons to the war, children who grew up without fathers, parents who outlived their children, the economic cost to communities that lost productive members, the social disruption when significant numbers of men didn't return from campaigns. Ancient sources rarely discuss these human costs in detail. The focus in contemporary accounts is on the political and military consequences, the shift in power balances, the territorial changes, the tribute and plunder. But behind every casualty figure was a person whose life ended, and a network of people whose lives were disrupted by that death. The magnitude of Egyptian losses at Carchemish meant that the social impact back in Egypt was substantial. Families throughout Egypt lost members. Communities that had sent contingents of troops received few back. The elite chariot warrior class, which had been central to Egyptian military tradition and social structure, was devastated. The knock-on effects probably included economic disruption as labour shortages developed, social instability as traditional hierarchies were disrupted, and a general sense of shock and grief at the scale of the disaster. Babylon, while victorious, also paid costs. The extended campaigns that followed Carchemish, as Nebuchadnezzar consolidated control over Syria and Palestine, required years of military effort. Soldiers were away from home for extended periods. Resources were devoted to military purposes rather than civilian needs. The building projects in Babylon that Nebuchadnezzar is famous for were partly financed by tribute from conquered territories, but they also required diverting resources and labour that might otherwise have gone to different purposes. The question of whether Carchemish and its aftermath were worth these costs depends on perspective and values. From a purely strategic viewpoint, Babylon gained enormously. The victory established military dominance that lasted decades. Tribute flowed into Babylon from subject territories. Babylonian prestige and power reached heights not seen since Hammurabi's time 1,000 years earlier. For Nebuchadnezzar personally, the victory secured his throne and his reputation. He ruled for over 40 years as one of the ancient world's most successful kings. His building projects transformed Babylon into a city that would be remembered as one of the wonders of the world. None of this would have been possible without the military success that began at Carchemish. From a human perspective, the cost was substantial. Thousands died at Carchemish and in subsequent campaigns. Tens of thousands more were affected by those deaths. The Babylonian system that dominated the Near East after Carchemish was built on military power and enforced through threat of force. For subject peoples, particularly those who resisted and suffered for it like the Judeans, Babylonian rule meant destruction, deportation, and loss. Whether the magnificence of Babylon justified these costs is a moral question more than a historical one. What we can say historically is that Carchemish made possible everything that followed in Babylonian history for the next 70 years, and that its tactical lessons influenced warfare for millennia beyond that. The physical location where the battle was fought is today in southeastern Turkey, near the modern town of Carchemish on the Syrian border. The Euphrates still flows through the region, though dams have altered its character. Archaeological remains of the ancient city of Carchemish have been excavated, revealing a major settlement with substantial fortifications and evidence of occupation spanning thousands of years. The specific battlefield locations where Egyptian and Babylonian forces clashed in 605 BC are harder to pinpoint precisely. The landscape has changed over 2,600 years. The river may have shifted its course. Human activity has altered terrain. But somewhere in this region, on ground that modern visitors can walk, the Battle of Carchemish took place. The ground that absorbed the blood of Egyptian and Babylonian soldiers, the air that carried the whistle of thousands of arrows in flight, the spot where military history pivoted as archery proved for the first time it could be a decisive weapon, not just a supporting one. For anyone interested in military history, there's something powerful about visiting battlefields even millennia after the events, standing on ground where history was made, trying to envision how events unfolded, considering what it must have been like to be there that day. Carchemish doesn't have the name recognition that brings tourist crowds like Gettysburg or Waterloo, but its historical significance is at least as great. This was where the ancient world learned that battles could be won with arrows before swords were drawn, that traditional martial virtues weren't enough against properly organised firepower, that warfare had fundamentally changed. The lessons learned at Carchemish echoed through subsequent centuries, sometimes clearly recognised, sometimes unconsciously applied. Military organisations throughout history have had to grapple with the same fundamental challenge. How do you kill the enemy while minimising your own casualties? The answer demonstrated at Carchemish was to strike from distance with sufficient force to achieve decisive results before close combat occurs. This requires effective weapons, proper training, sound tactics, and strong leadership. When these elements combine, as they did for Nebuchadnezzar's forces in 605 BC, the results can be devastating. When they're absent, or executed poorly, as they were for Egyptian forces at Carchemish, disaster follows. Modern military professionals studying ancient warfare often focus on battles like Marathon or Cannae or Zama, engagements that are better documented and more famous. Carchemish deserves equal attention. It demonstrates fundamental tactical principles that remain valid. It shows how technological and organizational advantages can be decisive. It illustrates the importance of training and discipline in executing complex tactics under combat stress. It reveals how tactical innovation can shift strategic balances. These lessons are as relevant to modern warfare as they were 2,600 years ago. The weapons have changed, but the underlying dynamics of armed conflict show remarkable continuity across millennia. Carchemish offers a clear view of those dynamics, unobscured by the complexity of later military systems. It's warfare reduced to essentials. Two armies, different tactical approaches, terrain and weather and human factors, all interacting to produce decisive results. Studying it provides insight not just into ancient military history, but into the nature of warfare itself. The ultimate significance of Carchemish lies in what it revealed about the relationship between technology, organisation, and combat effectiveness. The Babylonian advantage wasn't primarily technological. Both sides had access to similar weapons and equipment. The composite bow wasn't a Babylonian secret weapon. Egyptian forces used composite bows too. The decisive advantages were organisational and tactical. Nebuchadnezzar understood how to employ his archers as the primary killing arm, not a supporting element. He organised them in formations that maximised their collective effectiveness. He trained them to shoot in disciplined volleys that created concentrated firepower. He positioned them where they could engage enemy forces at optimal range, while being protected by supporting troops. He integrated all elements of his army, archers, infantry, cavalry, into a tactical system where each element enhanced the others. This organisational and tactical sophistication made the difference. Egyptian forces, despite their courage, and despite having access to similar weapons, couldn't match Babylonian effectiveness, because they hadn't developed comparable organisation and tactics. They were still fighting based on older paradigms where archery was supplementary and decisive results came from close combat. By the time they realised this was wrong, at Carchemish, it was too late to adapt. Their army was already destroyed. This pattern repeats throughout military history. Technological parity doesn't ensure battlefield parity if one side has superior organisation and tactics. The side that better understands how to employ available tools, that trains more effectively, that coordinates different elements more smoothly, that adapts more quickly to changing circumstances, that side wins even when the equipment is comparable. Carchemish demonstrated this principle clearly and decisively. The Egyptians lost not because they were less brave or less skilled as individuals, but because their organisation and tactics were inferior. Their courage became tragic rather than heroic when channeled through ineffective tactics against superior organization. This is perhaps the hardest lesson of Carchemish, and the one most relevant across all of military history. Individual courage and skill matter, but organization and tactics matter more. The best trained individual soldiers fighting bravely but employing poor tactics will lose to adequately trained soldiers employing sound tactics. This isn't meant to diminish personal courage or skill, which are essential and admirable, but to recognize that they're not sufficient. Victory requires combining human qualities with effective systems. Babylon had both at Carchemish. Egypt had the human qualities but lacked the effective systems. The result was catastrophe for Egypt and triumph for Babylon. And warfare, for better and worse, was forever changed. The age when battles were won primarily through close combat and personal heroism had ended. The age of organized firepower had begun. From the banks of the Euphrates in 605 BC to battlefields around the world today, that fundamental shift has shaped how humans fight and die in war. It all began at Carchemish, when Babylonian arrows demonstrated that courage alone wasn't enough, and victory would go to those who best understood how to organize and employ mass killing at distance. The thunder of Egyptian chariots faded into history. The whistle of Babylonian arrows announced the future,